Legacy is not just what we inherit, it's what we learn when the world strips us down to our pride and our dignity. The story ahead is filled with humiliation, quiet strength, and the kind of moment where truth crashes into arrogance and rewrites everything. I want you to hear every twist and feel every revelation. Make sure to subscribe, press like, and comment about where you are tuning in from, because your voice is part of this story too. James Carter, a 62-year-old black man in Atlanta, had carried the burdens of life with quiet strength for decades, but nothing prepared him for the heartbreak of losing his wife, Angela. For 40 years, they had walked side by side, raising their son David and building a modest but proud life in a world that often judged James by his skin before it ever measured his character. He had grown up in the South where whispers of discrimination were not whispers at all, but shouts from store clerks, glares from neighbors, and slights in workplaces that seemed to overlook his dedication. He endured it, bore it, and rose above it by focusing on hard work and dignity, providing for his family even when the odds weighed heavily against him. Angela had been his balance, the calm after every storm, the encouragement when bitterness tried to claim his heart, the proof that love could be stronger than prejudice. Her laughter filled their home. Her wisdom steered their son toward becoming a man who respected himself and others, and her touch grounded James when anger boiled inside him from being treated as less than he was. But all of that came crashing down when pancreatic cancer stole her life in less than 3 months. Those months were the cruelest James had ever endured. Nights in the hospital chair beside her bed, the smell of disinfectant mixing with fear, the soft hum of machines that mocked him with the rhythm of dying breaths. Those images carved themselves into his soul. And then there was her voice, frail yet firm, whispering one last request before the disease claimed her. She told him of a key hidden behind the velvet lining of her jewelry case, a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank. James had been too shattered to argue, too broken to question. He simply promised, though in the haze of grief, he thought she must have meant family papers, insurance policies, or perhaps some old savings bonds from her grandmother. After the funeral, the house felt like a hollow shell. He walked from room to room, hearing echoes of what once was the smell of peach cobbler still faint in the kitchen, the floral perfume still lingering in the bedroom, the memory of Angela's hands guiding his when they danced in the living room to a scratchy old record. Days blurred together until one evening he opened her jewelry box, the one she used to carefully organize each necklace and ring. Behind the velvet lining, just as she had said, was the small brass key. It lay in his palm, ordinary yet heavy. As though it contained more than just metal, it carried a secret she had guarded fiercely. 2 weeks later, restless and unable to bear the silence, James drove to First National Bank. The teller recognized his name and gave him a sympathetic look. She remembered Angela, remembered her warmth and her kindness. With hushed words, she guided James to the private room where the deposit boxes were kept. He sat alone, staring at the lock, his hands trembling as he slid the key in place. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have. Inside the small gray box was a thick manila envelope. His breath caught. He pulled it out, sat down at the narrow table, and opened it with careful fingers. What spilled out changed everything. Investment portfolios, stock certificates, real estate deeds, trust documents, all neatly labeled under Angela's maiden name. He flipped page after page, eyes wide, his heart racing as though the air had been sucked from the room. At the top was a handwritten sheet, Angela's tidy script spelling out numbers that made him dizzy: 120, 386, 415, over $120 million. James blinked, rubbed his eyes, read it again, thinking surely grief was distorting his sight. But it was real. Angela, the elementary school teacher who clipped coupons and insisted on hand-me-down furniture, had been a multi-millionaire for nearly 3 decades, and she had never told him. Shock coursed through him, followed by confusion, anger, betrayal, and awe. Why had she kept this from him? Why had she watched him work double shifts at the hospital, his hands cracked and calloused, just to pay for David's tuition? Why had she let him worry over bills, over repairs, over every dime when she had enough to buy entire streets of houses? The secret inside was more than numbers. It was power, responsibility, and a mirror reflecting all the years he had thought of himself as a poor man scraping by, when in truth, he had been married to a woman with unimaginable wealth. That night, he barely slept. He walked the creaking hallway, remembering the sacrifices he had made, the double shifts at the hospital, the nights spent repairing pipes with his own hands because calling a plumber cost too much. He thought of the Christmases when Angela insisted they keep it simple, the birthdays when they bought David books instead of electronics, and the vacations they skipped because the money wasn't there. And now he knew the money had been there all along, carefully hidden, carefully invested, growing like a seed planted in the dark. He felt anger prick at him, sharp and bitter, but each time it rose he pictured Angela's face, calm and steady, and he heard her voice reminding him that dignity was worth more than gold. Still, questions haunted him. How had she done it? A teacher's salary could never build $120 million. He returned to the documents, reading carefully. Real estate holdings traced back decades. Apartment complexes purchased in struggling neighborhoods that later gentrified, commercial properties quietly acquired under her maiden name, shares of tech companies bought when they were nothing more than risky startups. Angela had been shrewd, deliberate, patient. She had not stumbled upon this fortune by chance. She had built it stone by stone, decision by decision, and she had done so silently, never boasting, never letting the truth slip. James realized she had lived a double life, not in betrayal, but in protection. She had been the teacher by day and the silent investor by night, reading reports after grading homework, attending community meetings with the insight of a woman planning far beyond her classroom. And she had done it all without telling him, because she knew telling him would change the way he saw himself. James Carter was a proud black man who had endured a lifetime of being underestimated, and Angela had loved him enough to preserve that pride even if it meant carrying the weight of secrecy alone. He wept at the thought of her strength, of her sacrifice, and then he wept at the realization that now the burden was his. The next morning he sat with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand as the sun spilled across the worn wooden table. David called from Baltimore, his voice filled with the same youthful energy James had heard since he was a boy. "Morning, Dad," he said. "I just wanted to check in." James listened, offering encouragement, keeping his own secret locked tight behind his tongue. David talked about hospital rounds, about sleepless nights as a resident, and about someone new in his life, though he did not yet say her name. James's heart swelled with pride for his son, the boy he had raised to overcome the barriers that came with his skin color, the boy who had beaten odds to stand as a doctor in a field that had once excluded people like him. Hanging up, James looked again at the envelope. The fortune could make life easy for David. It could wipe away debt, buy him a home, smooth his path, but would it also rob him of the grit that had carried him this far? Would it make him soft? Make him forget the lessons of sacrifice and perseverance? James thought of his own youth, of nights spent cleaning offices where men in suits walked past him without acknowledgement, of supervisors who praised his work yet denied him promotions. He thought of how those experiences had hardened him, had carved into him a sense of worth that no paycheck could provide. He did not want to rob David of that steel. That evening, James walked through the neighborhood. The streets were cracked, the street lights dim, the houses weary but proud. He thought of what the money could do here, how it could repair sidewalks, build schools, provide scholarships for kids who looked like David had at 10 years old. Angela had not just left behind wealth, she had left behind possibility. But James knew he could not rush. He needed to understand how those around him truly saw him, how they valued him without the shadow of money altering their judgment. He thought of the whispers he had heard over the years, white colleagues calling him the maintenance guy as though the title stripped him of humanity, neighbors who assumed he lived on the edge of poverty because of his skin. He thought of the men who shook his hand but looked past him in the same moment. What would they do if they knew he had more money than they could ever dream of? That night, as the crickets hummed outside his window, James made a vow. He would not reveal the money, not yet. He would keep the secret close, testing the hearts of those who claimed to respect him. He would see if their respect held steady when they believed he was nothing more than an old black maintenance worker with a tired back and a modest pension. And when the truth came, as it inevitably would, they would reveal themselves for who they truly were. The days that followed blurred into weeks. James moved through his routines, repairing broken machines at the hospital, eating dinners alone, attending church on Sundays where the pastor's words about humility and grace struck deeper than ever before. He sat quietly as friends spoke of struggles to pay bills, biting back the truth that he could write a check and erase their troubles. David looked older than the boy James remembered teaching to ride a bike, but he still had the same bright eyes that now carried both exhaustion from long nights at the hospital and a glow that hinted at something else. "Dad, I want you to meet someone," David said, his voice carrying that nervous excitement James had heard before big exams. James felt the weight of Angela's absence more than ever in that moment, wishing she were there to guide their son with her calm wisdom. But now it was up to him. He leaned back, his hands folded together, nodding for David to continue. David's voice softened. "Her name is Emily Whitmore. She's amazing, Dad. She's studying business at Georgetown, and she's beautiful and smart, and I think she might be the one." James smiled gently, but inside a storm brewed. Whitmore. He had heard the name before in newspapers and business circles, a family tied to banks and old money, a family far removed from the streets where he had grown up. He looked at his son's glowing face and forced himself to focus not on the name, but on the love shining in David's eyes. "Do you love her?" James asked. David nodded without hesitation. "More than anything." James exhaled slowly. He remembered the days when David was just a child, bringing home report cards Angela would tape proudly to the fridge. He remembered Angela's insistence that their son never feel limited by the color of his skin, that he believed his dreams could be just as large as anyone else's. James had worked 2 jobs to pay for textbooks, had patched roofs and replaced water heaters so their boy could focus on studies. And now that boy was a man, a doctor, ready to bring someone else into their family. James knew the test was beginning. He would keep the money hidden, not because he doubted his son's love, but because he wanted to see if David's choice of partner and her family would show the kind of respect Angela always said mattered more than gold. When the weekend came, James prepared his home for Emily's visit. He set out Angela's best dishes, polished the wooden table, and even attempted her famous roast, though he doubted he could replicate her touch. The doorbell rang and there she stood, Emily Whitmore, with her honey blonde hair and the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to question her place in the world. Her smile was warm, her handshake polite, and her compliments rehearsed. "Mr. Carter, your home is so lovely," she said, her eyes flicking quickly across the modest furniture and the old family photos lining the walls. James caught the glance, subtle but sharp like a blade wrapped in silk. Over dinner, she asked about his work at the hospital, her tone light, her words carefully chosen, but there was a lilt in her voice when she emphasized the word maintenance that made James's jaw tighten. "That must be so fulfilling, keeping everything running," she said, sipping her wine with a smile that did not reach her eyes. David jumped in quickly, defending his father. "He's head of facilities management for the whole hospital. They can't function without him." Emily smiled again, sweet and practiced. "Of course, essential workers are so important." The phrase hung in the air, pleasant on the surface, but carrying an undercurrent of condescension. James had heard tones like that before, in boardrooms where men in suits praised him for his reliability while treating him as invisible. He chewed his food slowly, keeping his thoughts to himself, watching David beam beside her, clearly smitten. He did not want to crush his son's joy, but the test was already revealing its first clues. After dinner, James stood at the sink wrapping leftovers when he overheard their voices on the porch. Emily's tone shifted, no longer polished for his ears. "Babe, are you sure about having the wedding here in Atlanta? Your father seems sweet, but my parents are used to a certain level. Maybe we could have a small ceremony here and then a bigger reception at the club. That way everyone feels comfortable." James froze, the foil crinkling in his hands. His son's voice came sharper than expected. "My father raised me here. This is where I'm from." Emily softened her reply. "And I love that about you, David. It's refreshing. I just want everyone to feel at ease. Sometimes people from different worlds, well, they can feel out of place." James felt his heart sink. He had heard enough. He hugged his son when they returned, smiled politely at Emily, and said it was a pleasure to meet her. But when he lay in bed that night, staring at the empty space beside him, he whispered to Angela, "You were right to hide it." He knew then that the 120 million would remain their secret until the right moment. He needed to see how far this would go. The days stretched into weeks, and James found himself drawn deeper into the orbit of the Whitmores. David was spending weekends in Maryland at their estate, and when he invited James to dinner at their home, James braced himself for what was coming. He walked into a world of polished marble floors, chandeliers that glowed like constellations, and voices that carried a confidence only old money could grant. Richard Whitmore extended a hand, firm and assessing, as if measuring James's strength. "David tells us you work at the hospital," he said, his tone polite, but laced with superiority. "Must be satisfying work, keeping the lights on." James answered evenly, "It has its rewards." Catherine Whitmore offered her own brand of subtle dismissal, gushing over the wedding while remarking, "Emily has always had diverse taste in people. It's one of her most admirable qualities." James sat quietly, watching his son transform in front of him. The confident boy he had raised now seemed deferential, apologetic, eager to please people who dismissed him as though he were a novelty. James's chest tightened with shame, not for himself, but for the son who was beginning to compromise his pride. Driving home that night, James felt the envelope's weight heavier than ever, even though it remained locked away. The Whitmores did not know it existed, did not know the man they treated as an afterthought could buy their estate twice over, but that was the point. The memory of Emily's subtle condescension during her first visit replayed in his mind, the way she had praised his home with polite detachment, the way she had emphasized maintenance like a label rather than a profession. James knew better than most how people with privilege often measured others, not by their integrity, but by status and possessions. He thought of Angela, of her steady voice reminding him that the true measure of character was revealed when no one was watching. He realized now that her fortune, hidden and preserved, had given him the perfect tool to expose the truth in others. By keeping it secret, he could see who respected him when they thought he was just an old black man living in a modest house. The test had already begun, and Emily's words had planted doubt deep in his chest. Later that morning, David arrived with Emily, and James greeted them with a practiced smile that hid his unease. She carried herself with confidence, her blonde hair falling perfectly into place, her eyes scanning his home again with that quiet appraisal he recognized from people who believed their background set them above others. James invited them in, served breakfast, and listened as Emily spoke of Georgetown, of internships with financial firms, of her parents' latest charity gala. Her words were smooth, but beneath them, James heard the subtle rhythm of someone who had never once worried about rent or bills or how to stretch a dollar until the next paycheck. When David excused himself to take a call from the hospital, James found himself alone with Emily for the first time. She smiled politely and said, "Mr. Carter, I admire the way you raised David. It's remarkable that he came so far considering where he started." Her voice was calm, but the implication cut deep. James met her gaze, forcing his own expression to remain steady. David came far because he worked hard and because his mother believed in him. Where he started is nothing to be ashamed of. Emily's smile flickered, but she quickly smoothed it back into place. James knew then that his suspicions were not misplaced. When David returned, glowing from a call about a successful surgery, Emily slipped her hand into his and beamed at him with affection that appeared genuine. James watched silently, torn between joy for his son's happiness and unease about the world Emily represented. That evening, when the young couple left, James sat in his recliner with the envelope on his lap. He traced Angela's handwriting on the summary page, remembering her steady faith in him. She had known that money changes people, that it reveals who they are beneath the surface. He realized that the Whitmores were already showing him their hand. Days later, David invited James to dinner at the Whitmore estate. James dressed in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Angela's funeral, and drove to Maryland. The estate rose like a monument to old wealth. Manicured lawns, white columns, and chandeliers glowing through tall windows. Inside, Richard Whitmore greeted him with a handshake firm enough to test strength, his eyes sharp with assessment. Catherine followed, gracious but distant, offering wine and compliments that sounded rehearsed. Over dinner, they spoke of business, of politics, of people they knew in high places. When conversation turned to the wedding, Catherine smiled at James and said, "We're so thrilled Emily found someone with such diverse experiences." It speaks to her open-mindedness. James kept his jaw tight, responding with a nod. He watched David shrink into politeness, offering to contribute to wedding expenses he clearly could not afford. Catherine touched his arm with a laugh. "Don't be silly, darling. We understand the financial differences." The word struck James like a slap. Financial differences, as though he were some burden they would graciously carry. He chewed his food in silence, every bite heavy with humiliation. He thought of Angela, of how she would have smiled sweetly and cut them down with words so gentle they would not realize they had been chastised until hours later. He wished for her strength, her grace, but all he had was the truth locked in that envelope. After dinner, as he walked alone to his car, James felt shame not for himself, but for his son, who seemed to bend under the Whitmore's gaze. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, anger simmering beneath his skin. James knew he could not decline without appearing distant, and so he found himself once again standing before the towering columns of a house that seemed more like a palace than a home. He straightened his tie, the same one he had worn to Angela's funeral, and whispered a prayer for patience before walking inside. Richard greeted him with the same calculating handshake, firm and unyielding, his eyes scanning James as if he were taking stock of a machine rather than a man. Catherine followed with her customary grace, her smile polished but cold, and her words dripping with a politeness that barely concealed superiority. "Samuel, we are so glad you could join us again," she said, misnaming him deliberately though David had corrected her before. James did not flinch. He had endured far worse insults in his life. He simply nodded, offering a polite reply that masked a fire stirring within him. Emily appeared moments later, her beauty undeniable, her demeanor polished, but her eyes carried that same glint of appraisal James had noticed in his living room. David stood beside her, visibly nervous, eager to please everyone in the room, his laughter slightly forced as he ushered his father into the grand dining hall. The table stretched long and glistening beneath the glow of a chandelier, silverware aligned perfectly, crystal glasses catching the light. James felt the weight of wealth pressing in from every direction. Not because he lacked it, he carried Angela's secret fortune locked in his desk drawer, but because he chose to keep it hidden, a shield to reveal the truth of those around him. Over cocktails, Richard spoke of markets and politics, sprinkling names of senators and CEOs into the conversation like trophies on display. James listened quietly, his thoughts drifting to how Angela would have smirked at the performance, how she would have whispered later that real power never needed to announce itself. Catherine leaned across the table during the first course, her tone syrupy sweet as she said, "David tells us you've worked at the hospital for quite some time. That must have been so steady for you." James sipped his water, hearing the implication that steady meant small, safe, insignificant. He answered simply, "It has kept me busy." Catherine smiled wider, undeterred. "It's admirable, really, dedicating a life to service. Emily has always admired people from different walks of life. It broadens her perspective. Different walks of life." James felt the words pierce like a thin blade, reducing his son to an exotic choice rather than a man of equal worth. Emily giggled softly, placing her hand on David's arm as if to affirm her mother's statement, and David, instead of bristling as James once taught him, simply smiled weakly. James pressed his lips together to keep from speaking out. He needed to see more, to watch carefully, to let the truth unravel fully before deciding his next move. When talk turned to the wedding budget, Richard pulled out a leather-bound planner, his tone shifting into command. "Of course, we'll handle the major expenses," he said. "We understand the financial differences between our families." James nearly choked on his food, the audacity so blatant it almost made him laugh. He thought of the number at the top of Angela's handwritten note, $120 million, and of how easily he could buy and sell every asset the Whitmores flaunted. Yet he remained silent, nodding politely as though he accepted their charity. David, to James's dismay, quickly offered, "I'll contribute what I can, I promise." Catherine patted his hand as though comforting a child. "Don't be silly, darling. You focus on your career. We'll take care of everything." James watched the exchange with a hollow ache in his chest. The boy he had raised to be proud of his roots, to respect honest work, was bowing to people who saw him as little more than a novelty. As the evening stretched on, James found himself drifting into memories of Angela. He remembered how she had carried herself in rooms like this back when they were young and invited to events through her school connections. She never allowed anyone to diminish her. She smiled with warmth but never bent her spine. He could almost hear her voice telling him now, "Stay calm, let them show who they are." Dessert came, delicate pastries arranged like jewels on silver platters, but James tasted only bitterness. Conversation turned to the guest list, and Catherine began listing names of politicians and business leaders, asking where James would like his friends seated. "The venue can hold 300, she said, her tone brisk. James responded honestly, "I don't need many invitations. Most of my family is gone, and I have perhaps 20 friends I'd like to see there." Catherine's smile tightened. "Of course, smaller families can be cozier." Richard cleared his throat. "We'll need to consider seating carefully. Some of our guests will be senators and judges, so we'll want to ensure everyone feels comfortable." James caught the unspoken message clearly. His 20 friends from the hospital and the neighborhood would not be seated near senators and CEOs. He nodded slowly, tucking the sting into his chest. On the drive home, the shame pressed heavier than the wheel beneath his hands. He was not ashamed of himself, nor of his work, nor of his friends who had stood by him through hardship. He was ashamed that his son had sat in silence, allowing others to treat his father as though he were a burden. He thought of Angela again, of how she would have handled the Whitmores, how her dignity would have shamed them without her ever raising her voice. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered into the empty car, "I miss you, Angie. I need your strength." Back at home, James unlocked the drawer and unfolded the bank statement again, letting his eyes linger on the balance. That silence haunted him more than the Whitmore's arrogance, because he had raised David to stand firm against disrespect, to be proud of who he was and where he came from. James replayed Angela's voice in his mind, reminding him to stay calm and watch, to let people reveal themselves before judgment fell. He reminded himself that was what he was doing, waiting, watching, testing. The test was about to sharpen. Invitations for the rehearsal dinner arrived, delivered on heavy cream-colored paper embossed with gold lettering. James opened his envelope and frowned when he saw the seating chart tucked neatly inside. His name appeared beside Table 12. Near the back, a table designated for what Catherine had labeled casual guests. His 20 friends from the hospital and the neighborhood were clustered there too, far from the head table where senators, judges, and corporate executives would sit. He folded the chart carefully, his jaw tight, and placed it back in the envelope. He would not react yet. He would wait. When the evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived, James wore his best suit, the one he had purchased for Angela's funeral, the one that carried memories of her last embrace. He walked into the Whitmore's glittering dining hall where chandeliers sparkled like stars, and he followed the usher to the back, where Table 12 was set near the service doors. The clinking of plates and the bustle of servers drowned out conversation at that table, while laughter and polite applause echoed from the head of the room where the Whitmores presided over their distinguished guests. James sat quietly, his face calm, though humiliation burned in his chest. From his seat, he could see David at the front, smiling awkwardly as Catherine explained the seating arrangements to others. James noticed how his son avoided looking in his direction. That avoidance hurt more than words. Catherine stood and clinked her glass, addressing the room with a practiced smile. "We are so grateful to welcome all of you as we prepare to join our families together. It is important to us that everyone feels comfortable, and that includes seating arrangements that ensure harmony for all our guests." Her eyes flicked briefly toward James's table, and though her smile never faltered, the message was clear. People like him did not belong at the center. Some guests chuckled politely, while others looked down uncomfortably. James folded his hands in his lap, hearing Angela's voice once more. He whispered inwardly, "I'll wait, Angie. I'll let them show themselves." During dinner, one of Catherine's acquaintances leaned across the table to Richard and said in a voice that carried farther than he realized, "It's wonderful how open-minded Emily is, marrying into such a different background. Shows real character." Richard smiled and nodded, raising his glass. James's stomach tightened. He chewed his food slowly, every bite tasting of bitterness rather than flavor. He reminded himself of his vow not to reveal the truth yet. He wanted to see how far this arrogance would stretch. After dinner, as guests mingled, James overheard another conversation near the bar. A man in a tailored suit whispered, "Do you think David's father will be comfortable at the country club wedding? I mean, he seems nice, but..." His words trailed off with a shrug that said more than his unfinished sentence. James turned away, unwilling to let anger consume him in front of strangers. He drove home late that night, the city lights blurring through his windshield as tears burned his eyes. He was not crying for himself. He had endured humiliation many times in his life. He was crying for his son, for the boy who had once boasted to his classmates that his father could fix anything, for the young man who had once stood tall beside him at Angela's funeral, holding his hand tightly. That boy was slipping away into a world where silence replaced pride and where the approval of the Whitmores mattered more than honoring his own father. The ushers greeted him politely, but without warmth, their eyes glancing at the chart before directing him once again to the back, to table 12 near the exit doors. James took his seat without complaint, but his heart burned as he saw the grandeur before him, white roses filling the air with fragrance, candles flickering across crystal glassware, and a head table so lavish it could have paid for half the tuition of the neighborhood kids back home. He sat among guests who seemed just as misplaced as he was. Distant cousins no one remembered, college acquaintances who scrolled on their phones, and old family friends relegated to the margins. From his seat, he had a perfect view of the altar where his son would stand, looking handsome in his tuxedo, a man who once carried pride in his heritage, but who now seemed molded into a shape the Whitmores found acceptable. James's chest tightened with sorrow as he thought of Angela, of how she would have stood proudly in this room and made sure everyone knew she was not to be diminished. She would have shed tears of joy for their son while simultaneously slicing through condescension with words sharp and sweet. Without her, James felt the weight of loneliness pressing heavier than ever. The ceremony began, and all eyes turned toward Emily as she glided down the aisle, radiant in a dress that reportedly cost more than James's car. Guests murmured about the elegance, the luxury, the refinement. James listened, but his mind drifted to the small church where he and Angela had married with barely 60 guests, where the decorations were paper flowers made by cousins and the food was cooked by neighbors. That wedding had cost almost nothing, yet it had been filled with genuine love, not showmanship. As David and Emily exchanged vows, James clapped politely, though his applause sounded hollow even to his own ears. The reception that followed was a display of wealth and influence more than a celebration of love. Senators and CEOs shook hands with Richard and Catherine, congratulating them on the union as though it were a merger between two companies rather than a marriage between two people. James sat at his back table, half hidden, listening as one guest remarked, "It's remarkable how David has adapted. He seems so genuine despite his background." Another replied, "Emily has always had a good eye for authenticity." James gripped his fork tightly, biting back words he wanted to unleash. Authenticity, they called it, as if his son were a curious artifact on display, rather than a man who had fought for everything he achieved. When the time came for speeches, James braced himself. Richard spoke first, his voice commanding the room as he declared how delighted they were to welcome David into their family. He emphasized generosity, patience, and tradition, painting a picture of themselves as benevolent hosts. Catherine followed, her toast dripping with self-satisfaction. When Emily first introduced us to David, we were impressed by his dedication, his humility, his authenticity. It has been a journey of learning for both families, and we are confident David will adjust beautifully to our traditions. We only hope his family can adjust to this new lifestyle as well. The words struck James like thunder. He scanned the room, waiting for his son to stand, to object, to defend the dignity of the family that had raised him. But David only nodded slightly, his face calm as if the insult had not sliced through the air for all to hear. James felt something inside him shift. It was not rage, it was colder, sharper, more deliberate. It was the resolve of a man who had waited long enough. He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked slowly toward the front. The murmurs in the room grew, curiosity spreading as guests realized this was unscripted. Catherine's smile wavered for the first time. Richard stiffened, ready to intervene, but James's presence carried authority, honed over decades of commanding respect and silence. He reached the front, turned to face 300 faces, and spoke with a calm that silenced the room. "Thank you for your kind words, Catherine. I would like to say something as well." His voice carried steady, every word deliberate. "You've spoken of adjusting to new lifestyles, and you are right. This marriage does bring together two different worlds. But I want to ask a question: should respect depend on lifestyle, or should it depend on who we are as people?" The room was still, the weight of his words settling like stone. James reached into his pocket and unfolded a paper, the same bank statement he had kept hidden for months. "I've been keeping a secret since my wife passed. She left me something when she died, something she built carefully over 30 years. She left me $120 million. Gasps rippled through the room, jaws slack, eyes wide. Catherine's face drained of color, Richard's eyes bulged in disbelief, and Emily looked as though her legs might give way beneath her. David froze, his expression torn between shock and recognition. James held the paper high for the front rows to see. $120 million, he repeated. "I could have bought this country club. I could have paid for this wedding 100 times over. But I chose not to reveal it because I wanted to see how people would treat me when they thought I had nothing." The revelation had shattered illusions, but what mattered now was what followed, how his son would react, how the Whitmores would scramble, how those hundreds of guests would whisper when the dust settled. As James reached the door, his heart pounded not with regret, but with a calm resolve, the kind that came from knowing he had spoken the truth in a room that had tried to bury him in shame. He stepped into the cool evening air, inhaling deeply as if breathing for the first time in months. Behind him, murmurs spread like wildfire. Catherine clutched her pearls, her pale face frozen in a mask of disbelief. Richard leaned across the table, demanding to see the document, his voice quivering with the desperation of a man who had just realized his assumptions had been built on sand. Emily swayed on her feet, mascara streaking down her cheeks as the weight of humiliation pressed against her polished composure. And David sat with tears brimming in his eyes, his father's words echoing louder than any applause he had received in his medical career. James knew his son's heart was breaking, because in that moment, David realized he had betrayed not only his father, but also the values his mother had instilled in him since birth. James continued to walk toward a parking lot, but before he reached his car, he heard footsteps running behind him. David's voice, trembling and desperate, called out, "Dad, wait. Please, just wait." James stopped, though he did not turn immediately. His shoulders were stiff, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He had endured humiliation, revealed the truth, and now he braced for the confrontation that would decide everything. When David reached him, breathless in his tuxedo, his eyes red and swollen, James finally turned. The boy who had once held his hand at Angela's funeral stood before him now as a man stripped of illusions. "Dad, I'm so sorry," David whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know what happened to me. I don't know why I let them treat you like that. I forgot everything you and Mom taught me." James stared at him for a long moment, the anger in his chest slowly cooling into something steadier. "You forgot where you came from," James said quietly. "You started to believe their world was better than ours. You let them make you ashamed of me, ashamed of yourself." David shook his head, tears spilling freely. "No, Dad, you're right. I let myself get swept up. I thought marrying into their world meant success. I thought it would mean respect. But tonight I saw the truth. They don't respect me. They don't respect you. They only care about what we can offer them." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the tremor in his body. "Respect isn't bought, David. It's earned. It's lived. Your mother knew that. That's why she hid the money. She wanted us to learn the value of character before the weight of wealth could crush us." David's breath caught as he asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" James's eyes softened. "Because I needed to see who you would become without it. Money changes people. And tonight I saw how their money changed you. Imagine what it would have done if you'd grown up knowing we had more than 100 million in the bank. It would have poisoned everything." David nodded slowly, shame etched across his face. "You're right. I lost myself. But I want to make it right. I want to honor Mom, and I want to honor you." James reached into his jacket and pulled out another folded paper. Not the bank statement, but the letter Angela had written in her careful handwriting. He handed it to David, watching as his son unfolded it with trembling hands. The words hit him like a wave. Angela's plan to use the fortune to establish the Angela and James Carter Foundation, a scholarship fund for working class and minority students who dreamed of becoming doctors, teachers, and engineers, but lacked the resources. She had written that the foundation was to be their legacy, a way to honor the values they had lived by, ensuring that education and dignity would matter more than privilege and family names. David clutched the letter to his chest, sobbing openly. "She already thought of everything," he whispered. James nodded. She always did. For a moment, father and son stood in the parking lot together, the hum of distant laughter from the ballroom muffled by the glass walls. The weight of the evening pressed down on them, but so did the clarity of truth. James squeezed his son's shoulder firmly. What happens next is up to you. You can go back in there and let them control you, or you can stand tall and show them who you really are. You can let them shame you into silence, or you can prove to them and to yourself that you're not defined by their approval. David wiped his face, his jaw tightening with newfound resolve. I have to face them. I have to tell Emily the truth about who I am and what I will not compromise. James stepped back, allowing his son the space to choose his path. As David turned toward the glowing windows of the country club, James called out softly, "One more thing." David paused. "Your mother wanted you to be part of the foundation one day, but only when you understood the difference between having money and being defined by it. Tonight you showed me you're not ready yet, but I hope someday you will be." David nodded slowly, holding the letter tightly, and walked back toward the ballroom with a steadiness that had been missing for months. James watched him go, pride mingling with sorrow. He knew this was only the beginning of his son's reckoning, but at least the first step had been taken. James turned back toward his car, the cool night wrapping around him like a cloak. For the first time in months, he felt something he had not felt since Angela's passing: clarity. He understood now that wealth was not the test, but the tool. The true test was whether dignity and respect could survive without it, whether love could outlast arrogance, whether family could remain family when faced with the weight of prejudice. He drove home through the quiet streets of Atlanta, past a church where he and Angela had married, past a hospital where he had spent 3 decades keeping systems alive, past a neighborhood where kids still played on cracked sidewalks. He parked in front of his modest home and sat in silence for a long moment before stepping inside. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. David Carter walked back toward the glowing ballroom of the country club, with Angela's letter clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing and his heart heavy with shame. The words of his mother, written so carefully, struck deeper than any reprimand his father had ever given him. She had planned a foundation not to flaunt wealth, but to lift others who came from backgrounds like his, children who might otherwise be crushed by the weight of poverty and prejudice. As he pushed open the door and stepped back inside, the room turned to him with expectant stares, whispers rising like smoke through the air. Emily rushed toward him, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "David, what was that? What is happening? Did your father tell the truth?" she asked frantically, her voice shrill with panic. David looked at her and for the first time saw clearly the distance between their worlds, not measured in money, but in values. He nodded slowly. "Yes, he told the truth. My mother left behind a fortune, and my father kept it hidden to see who respected him for who he was." Emily's eyes widened, then narrowed, not with relief, but with calculation. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell my parents? Do you understand what this could have meant for us, for our future?" David pulled his arm away gently but firmly. "That's the problem, Emily. All you can see is what it could mean for you. But you didn't see my father sitting at the back of this room, treated like a burden. You didn't see the way your family dismissed him, and I let it happen. I let it happen because I thought joining your world was success." The whispers grew louder as guests leaned closer, straining to catch every word of the confrontation. Catherine stood at the head table, pale and trembling, while Richard clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the polished wood. Emily's voice cracked as she pleaded, "I love you, David. You know I do. I didn't mean any harm. My parents, they just have expectations." David's heart ached because part of him wanted to believe her, but he remembered his father's words in the parking lot, the reminder that respect and love could not survive on convenience. "If love means watching you stand silent while they shame my family, then maybe I don't know what love is anymore," he said quietly. Emily's face crumpled and she fled the room, leaving a trail of whispers and gasps in her wake. David stood tall, though his knees trembled, and turned to the crowd. "My father is right," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I forgot who I was. I let myself believe that money and power defined worth, but my parents taught me better. My mother was a teacher who gave everything to her students, and my father kept a hospital running for decades so doctors could save lives. They raised me to be proud of where I came from, and I let that pride slip away. Tonight, I take it back." The room fell silent, Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their faces red with embarrassment. Others stared in awe, unaccustomed to seeing someone defy the Whitmores in their own domain. Richard finally stood, his voice booming. "That's enough, David. This is neither the time nor the place." But David faced him squarely, his voice steady. "It is exactly the time and the place. This is where the humiliation happened, in front of all these people. And this is where the truth needs to be heard." James, standing near the door, watched with tears in his eyes as his son found his voice again, the voice he and Angela had nurtured through years of sacrifice. He had not expected David to act so quickly, but seeing him stand tall filled James with a pride deeper than any fortune could bring. Catherine tried to intervene, her voice trembling. "David, please, let's not create a scene. We can discuss this privately." David shook his head. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. The scene was created when you sat my father at the back table. The scene was created when you spoke of my family needing to adjust to your lifestyle. The scene was created when you made it clear that respect in this room depended on wealth and color. I will not be silent anymore." A ripple of applause began at one table, then another, until a smattering of claps filled the hall. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. Some guests, especially those who had felt their own brushes with prejudice, stood in quiet solidarity. Richard's face turned crimson, but he said nothing further. David stepped away from the head table and crossed the room to stand beside his father. The two men embraced, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between them. "I'm proud of you," James whispered. James Carter and his son David walked away from the country club in silence, their footsteps echoing in the night air as though they were leaving behind not just a building, but a world that had tried to strip them of their worth. The glow of chandeliers through the windows seemed dimmer now, less powerful, as if the truth spoken inside had drained the arrogance from its walls. For James, the night had been a battlefield where he had endured humiliation, revealed Angela's secret, and tested the hearts of those who had claimed respect, but showed only disdain. For David, it had been a reckoning, a confrontation with the truth about himself, his fiancée, and the family he had nearly surrendered his soul to. As they reached James's car, David turned to his father, his face still wet from tears, but his voice steady. "Dad, I need to ask you something. Do you think I can make this right? After what I let them do, after the silence I kept, can I still honor you and Mom?" James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the same way he had when David was a boy, frightened by the dark. "Of course you can. That's the thing about respect and dignity. They're not gone forever once lost. They can be reclaimed, but only if you fight for them every day. Your mother wanted you to learn that lesson, and tonight you began to learn it." David nodded, clutching Angela's letter in his hand. "I want to start with the foundation. I want to be involved, not for the money, but for the meaning. I want to make sure kids like me, kids from neighborhoods like ours, get the chance to dream big." James's chest swelled with pride. "That's what your mother wanted. She didn't build this fortune to buy respect. She built it to create opportunity. Respect is earned by how you live, not by what you own." They drove home through the quiet streets of Atlanta, past the hospital where James had spent decades keeping systems alive, past the church where Angela had once led children's choirs, past the neighborhoods where families still struggled but carried themselves with pride. When they pulled into the driveway of the modest Carter home, James felt something he had not felt since Angela's passing: peace. Inside the house, the familiar creak of the floorboards and the scent of old wood wrapped around them like a blanket. David looked at the photographs on the mantle, at the smiling faces of grandparents and cousins long gone, at the picture of Angela holding him as a baby, her eyes bright with love. "We were rich all along, weren't we?" David said softly. James smiled faintly. "Yes, son. We measured wealth differently, not by money, but by love, by character, by dignity. That's what made us rich." The following weeks brought difficult conversations. David met with Emily one final time, not to argue, but to speak plainly. "I can't build a life with someone who sees my family as less," he told her. She wept and tried to argue, but he stood firm, the letter in his pocket reminding him of what mattered. The engagement ended quietly, though whispers spread quickly and the Whitmores retreated into silence, their influence diminished by the humiliation of that night. Meanwhile, James and David began the work of bringing Angela's vision to life. They met with lawyers and financial advisors, carefully structuring the Angela and James Carter Foundation. James insisted that the scholarships focus not just on grades, but on character, on perseverance, on the qualities that defined true wealth. David volunteered his time at local schools, speaking to students about his journey, about the mistakes he made, about the moment he almost lost himself to silence. He told them that dignity must never be traded for approval, that the world might try to define them by the color of their skin or the weight of their wallets, but their true measure would always be found in how they treated others. The first scholarship recipients were announced within a year: a young black woman from Atlanta who dreamed of becoming a doctor, a Latino boy whose parents worked 3 jobs to send him to school, a white girl from a rural town who had lost her father but refused to give up on her dream of teaching. The foundation was not just about race or background, but about breaking barriers, about giving opportunities to those who had been overlooked. James sat in the front row of the first award ceremony, his heart full as he listened to the students speak of their dreams. David stood at the podium, introducing them with pride, his voice steady and strong. In that moment, James saw his son fully reclaimed, not as the man who had bowed to the Whitmores, but as the man Angela had raised him to be. Later that night, James sat in his recliner, the same chair where he had once helped David with homework, where Angela had once graded papers, where they had watched their son graduate from medical school on a live stream during the pandemic. He looked around the quiet house, at the memories that lived in every corner, and he whispered into the silence, "We did it, Angie. We turned the money into meaning. We turned pain into purpose." He closed his eyes and felt her presence in the stillness, as though she were smiling beside him. The journey had been painful, filled with humiliation and betrayal, but it had ended with clarity. Respect could not be bought. Dignity could not be granted by others. True wealth was measured not by millions in a bank account, but by love, by integrity, by the legacy one left behind. The end. If you've stayed with me through this story, I'd like to ask you something important. If you enjoyed following James Carter's journey, his trials, his revelations, and the legacy that turned pain into purpose, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps us keep telling stories that remind us all about dignity, respect, and what true wealth really means. And I'd love to hear from you what part of this story struck you the most. Was it the moment James revealed the hidden fortune, or when David finally stood up to reclaim his pride? Tell me your thoughts about the plot in the comments below, and also share where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States or somewhere else in the world? Your words and your location mean a lot to us because this community is about connecting across boundaries and learning from each other. So don't forget, like, subscribe, and comment where you are because every voice adds to the conversation.